The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to review three topics: the Federal Radionavigation Plan, the Foreign Spill Protection Act that Mr. Corbello is bringing, and the National Icebreaker Fund Act of 2015. The first item for consideration is the Federal Radionavigation Plan, or FRP, which is the federal government's primary policy and planning document for positioning, navigation, and timing, commonly referred to as PNT. The plan describes the government's role, responsibilities, and policies regarding PNT systems and data, and is updated every 2 years through the joint efforts of the Departments of Defense, Transportation, and Homeland Security. The Global Positioning System, or GPS, is the most recognized PNT system and is vital to U.S. national security, the safe operation and reliability of critical infrastructure, and economic prosperity. GPS signals have been incorporated into virtually every technology, from cell phones to financial systems, the power grid, and information systems. Marine transportation systems are also highly dependent of GPS. The vast majority of the millions of recreational vessels, fishing vessels, commercial vessels, and foreign vessels that call on U.S. ports rely on at least one, if not many, GPS-based systems for safe navigation, collision avoidance, and emergency procedures. With the growing dependency on GPS in this nation, it is concerning that the Department of Homeland Security officials have called GPS a single point of failure for critical infrastructure. In 2004, the Department of Transportation began working with DHS to acquire a backup system for GPS under a directive from President George W. Bush. President Obama continued the directive, and in the 2008 edition of the FRP, the signatory agencies outlined a plan to develop a GPS backup system. However, the next two editions of the FRP failed to provide a backup system. The ranking member and I sent a letter last year to the Secretaries of Transportation, Homeland Security, and Defense, asking that the 2014 version of the FRP outline the government's plan for addressing the problem. The 2014 edition of the plan was released in May and does not identify what action will be taken or the lead agency. It has been 11 years since acknowledgement of this problem, and we need to move beyond discussing GPS vulnerability and start addressing the issue of how to fix it. The second item for consideration is Mr. Corbello's bill, H.R. 1684, the Foreign Spill Protection Act of 2015. The bill would include foreign offshore units where there is a discharge or the substantial threat of oil discharge reaching U.S. waters or shores within the liability section of the Oil Pollution Act. The foreign offshore units would be a responsible party liable for removal costs and damages in the same manner as a U.S. offshore facility. The 2010 BP Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico showed that technology can fail and that existing response policies can be inadequate. The impacts of that spill are still being felt in the region. BP costs for the spill damages are currently over $50 billion. The size, scope, and cost of that spill raises concerns about foreign deepwater or oil drilling operations that could impact U.S. waters and shorelines. The subcommittee held a hearing in January 2012 to review offshore drilling in Cuba and the Bahamas, the Coast Guard's oil spill readiness and response planning. At the hearing, the Coast Guard discussed how through international conventions and frameworks, the Coast Guard is working with Caribbean nations, including Cuba and the Bahamas, to coordinate to combat spill events. The Coast Guard also discussed its national contingency plan and the work of the national response teams and their planning and preparedness efforts with state and local communities. I'm interested to hear today about what agreements the Coast Guard has with its international partners, what prevention actions are being adopted to prevent more spills in the future, and in the event that a spill occurs, what type of international response and coordination we can expect. Hey, here's the ranking members here. It's always special for us. H.R. 1684 gets at a specific issue that there be a responsible party to pay for cleanup and damages for a foreign-sourced oil spill that impacts U.S. waters and adjacent shorelines. While the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund could be used when there is no responsible party, it limits all costs to $1 billion. Any spill, even near the scope of the Deepwater Horizon spill, would quickly overwhelm the fund. U.S. taxpayers shouldn't be on the hook for any costs not covered by the fund for a spill that originates outside of the U.S., especially if the foreign offshore unit has a known owner or operator. I understand the Coast Guard may have concerns with the legislation and look forward to talking and getting their take on it and talking about the bill today. The last item for consideration today is a draft bill, the National Icebreaker Fund Act. The bill would create a funding source that could be used for the alteration or renovation of icebreakers and the lease or charter of private icebreakers. The Polar Sea, currently inactive, and the Polar Star are both beyond their original 30-year service life. The Polar Star was recently renovated and is working within an estimated 7 to 10-year service life extension. The Healy will reach its estimated end-of-life service in 2030. This conservatively puts us to 5 to 15 years away from end-of-service life for the two active icebreakers, the Polar Sea, if it gets a 7 to 10-year extension in the coming years. The operational status, more accurately the non-operational status of the icebreakers, is creating mission gaps. The older the icebreakers get, the longer it takes the administration to come up with a replacement plan, the closer we are to end-of-service life of the icebreakers, or worst-case scenario where we find ourselves with no icebreakers whatsoever. Years are passing with no progress on the acquisition or charter leasing of an icebreaker or on decisions to reactivate the Polar Sea. Congress has restricted the use of the Coast Guard acquisition funds to the construction of an icebreaker that can carry out Coast Guard missions. U.S. icebreakers have supported numerous executive agency missions, and the Coast Guard should not bear the burden of the full cost of building an icebreaker, because they simply can't pay for an icebreaker. The draft bill, the National Icebreaker Fund Act, would provide funding for long or short-term solutions for renovating the aging icebreakers or chartering or leasing an icebreaker to alleviate the extent possible mission gaps. In addition, through further discussion and bipartisan cooperation, the bill has been modified to include construction as the use of the fund. The bill should be viewed as part of a broader solution for the Coast Guard and its icebreakers, and I look forward to talking about that today. The icebreakers in general, no one's doing this yet, meaning this is the only and the first shot we have done on actually trying to get something built or leased or anything, and that's what Mr. Garamundi and I have been working on. So hopefully it at least goes somewhere or gets the ball rolling in the right direction. And with that, I yield Mr. Garamundi. This is what happens when you have 3 different topics for a hearing. The intro is too long. I yield to the ranking member.
Well, I can shorten mine and really come down to 2 different types of time. One is real time, which I suppose the GPS and the E-Lorraine system would accomplish. The other is federal time. Federal time seems to be the forever time, and we have at least 2 great examples of federal time here. One, the E-Lorraine system, which was identified as a backup to the GPS system, gee whiz, almost 20 years ago. Well, 15 years ago anyway. And here we are, federal time, marking time, and not yet done. And the other is icebreaker, which is also operating on federal time, which seems to be forever. We ought to get about how to get it done. I'm going to submit my testimony for the record, but if we continue working on federal time, we're going to have a very serious problem. And so my intention, together with you, Mr. Chairman, is to operate on real time and get something done. It's been way past time. We absolutely have to have a backup system. The GPS is vulnerable. I think we all know that for a variety of reasons, all of which are going to be discussed today. And if we don't get off the dime and get down to real time and get this thing done, there's going to be a world of hurt for this nation and others. The icebreaker is similar. We could ponder and eventually somebody's going to get stuck in the ice, and then somebody's going to wonder why it wasn't done. And the reason it wasn't done is that your United States Congress, House and Senate, together with the administration, was operating on federal time. In other words, forever. So let's get it done. Without objection, I'd like to have my written statement in the record.
So ordered. Good to go. Okay, let's introduce our witnesses today. First, we have, oh, I'm sorry, to the full committee ranking member, I yield.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for holding this hearing. I think the introduction of the bill on the replacement of the icebreakers is absolutely critical. We need to move ahead. I've made known to the chairman and others my potential preferred alternative, which is after they haul the Polar Sea and I'm Polar Star, and take a look at the hull integrity, that the gut and stuff option, I think, holds a lot of attractiveness, and we'll see the cost-benefit analysis. And, I got to give, Congressman Garamundi a lot of credit. He came to me, I think it was a year ago on the, or more, on the radio navigation idea, the single point of failure, GPS, incredible vulnerability for the United States of America and all of our national security and commerce in this country. So we need to move forward, no more delay, with a plan to have a backup system.
Just $40 million, we can do it.
40 million, yeah. We can find that under a couch cushion. I mean, if Paul Ryan can find $8 billion under a couch cushion, there's got to be 40 somewhere still under there. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank the ranking member. No, it's funny. My uncle, who's a scientist, had somebody called me and said, "Hey, don't get rid of GPS. It's really important." I said, "Well, we're not getting rid of GPS. We just want to make sure it's backed up, right? So if it goes away,
Get the right message
right."
out.
Our witnesses today, we have Mr. Gary Rassicott, Director of Marine Transportation Systems with the Coast Guard. We have Ms. Mary Landry, Director of Incident Management and Preparedness with the Coast Guard. Ms. Karen Van Dyke, Director of Positioning, Navigation, and Timing, P&T Director, and Spectrum Management, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology, U.S. Department of Transportation. And our last witnesses, and the gentleman who's accompanying him, Mr. Martin Fega, and he's accompanied by Mr. Charles Shue, which is Charles. There we go. Mr. Charles Shue, President and CEO of UrsANav. He'll be available to answer any member questions we have. So I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here today, and first yield to Mr. Gary Rassicott, Director of Marine Transportation Systems of the Coast Guard.
Sorry about that. Rookie mistake. Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garimondi, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the nation's ice-breaking needs and the Federal Radionavigation Plan. My complete statement has been provided to the subcommittee, and I ask that it be entered into the record and that I be allowed to summarize my remarks. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, as you just discussed, the ability to operate safely and reliably in the polar regions is critical to the nation's security and economic interests. We greatly appreciate your generous time and interest you've invested in our existing icebreakers. Our only heavy icebreaker, Polar Star, has had a very busy year. The crew has been away from home for nearly 250 days. As the ranking member saw firsthand, Polar Star is 40 years old and being maintained only by the dedicated efforts of her crew and shore support team. Having one heavy icebreaker for polar deployments means that extensive maintenance activities must occur on Polar Star upon her return to the United States if the cutter is to be ready for the following year's deployment on Operation Deep Freeze and the breakout of McMurdo Station near the South Pole. Regarding Polar Sea, we recently signed a memorandum of agreement and provided funds to the Maritime Administration to initiate a preservation dry dock on Polar Sea before the end of this fiscal year. This work will slow the deterioration of the hull and machinery and preserve the vessel for layup work, which is necessary regardless of how we do the disposition. In conjunction with this dry dock, we have also taken initial steps in preparation for a full material condition assessment, as requested in the FY16 President's budget. Most recently, a preliminary evaluation of the project was completed last month in Seattle by the Naval Sea Systems Command. This critical work must be done prior to make a final determination on whether to reactivate or decommission the ship. Regardless of the final determination on Polar Sea's future, reactivation is only viable as a bridging strategy, and it does not mitigate the need for recapitalization of the nation's polar fleet. Regarding the Coast Guard's ongoing acquisition project, in January, we completed the preliminary operations requirements document for the new polar icebreaker. We anticipate finalizing these operational requirements among all of our interagency stakeholders by the end of calendar year 15. We're also in the process of finalizing an alternatives analysis, which we're on schedule to deliver to Congress this year. While the Coast Guard is the sole federal agency operating the nation's polar icebreaking program, the Federal Radionavigation Plan is jointly executed and reflects the official positioning, navigation, timing policy for the federal government, and is prepared by the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, and Transportation. In support of DHS, the Coast Guard defines the need for and provides aids to navigation and facilities required for the safe and efficient maritime navigation. As previously noted, the majority of today's maritime navigation is dependent on GPS positioning, navigation, and timing signal for their primary navigation. In addition, the Coast Guard provides a robust system of physical aids to navigation, which mariners use in conjunction with their electronics to safely navigate coastal and inland waters. The Coast Guard continues to leverage technology to enhance mariner situational awareness. We have aggressively worked with our maritime stakeholders to establish electronic aids to navigation around the country. To date, we have almost 200 in place that enhance the current U.S. ATON system. We are also working steadily towards transmitting maritime safety information to the mariner for real-time display on his electronic charting system. In closing, the Coast Guard is striving to meet the nation's polar icebreaking and maritime navigation needs, and we are committed to working with the committee and the interagency on these fronts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for all you do for the men and women of the United States Coast Guard. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Our second witness today is Ms. Mary Landry, Director of Incident Management and Preparedness with the Coast Guard.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Coast Guard's oil spill response capability, and thank you for your strong support of the Coast Guard. I have also submitted a complete statement to the subcommittee. I ask that it be entered into the record, and I be allowed to summarize my remarks. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the Coast Guard is committed to proactive oil spill prevention, preparedness, and response as the pre-designated federal on-scene coordinator for the coastal zone and the authority that originates from the Clean Water Act as amended by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 and also by regulation in the National Oil and Hazardous Substance Pollution Contingency Plan. Our preparedness and response efforts involve coordination with numerous state and federal agencies, as well as international partners, private sector, non-governmental organizations, science institutions, and academia. This collaboration ensures government and industry have the necessary oil spill response equipment, capability, and contingency plans to address worst-case scenario discharges. In anticipation of increased maritime activities both domestically and internationally, we've focused recent efforts on the Caribbean and Arctic regions to mitigate potential risks associated with oil exploration and production. Specifically, the May 2013 Agreement on Cooperation on Marine Oil Spill Preparedness and Response in the Arctic, as signed by the members of the Arctic Council, focuses on Arctic-wide cooperation, coordination, and mutual assistance among parties on oil pollution preparedness and response. In March 2014, the development of the wider Caribbean Regional Multilateral Technical Operating Procedures, called MTOP, for offshore oil pollution response outlined a responder-to-responder network and framework between the U.S., Cuba, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Mexico. This framework is for participating nations to work effectively in response to large spills threatening more than one participating nation's waters. Additionally, arrangements are in place with the U.S. Department of Treasury Office of Foreign Asset Control and the U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of Industry and Security to enable U.S. commercial oil spill removal organizations, or OSROs, to conduct oil spill response in foreign waters. This authorization is granted in the form of licenses, both general and specific, are primarily utilized to enable responses to assist nations on which the U.S. has imposed economic and export sanctions. I also want to emphasize that the U.S. government can directly support foreign governments by providing response experts or technical advisors to spill sites. A recent example of this, January 2015, the U.S. Coast Guard and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, provided several oil spill cleanup professionals to the USAID mission in Bangladesh in response to an oil spill covering an estimated 3,900 square miles. Here at home, the National Response System has proven its resilience through its 45 years of service. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon incident pushed the limits of this system as we fought to save an ecosystem and a way of life along the Gulf Coast. As a result of the lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon, the Coast Guard has taken a number of actions to enhance our spill preparedness and response posture, including working more closely with local communities through our area committees to better integrate their capabilities into our response. The Coast Guard also established a full-time deployable National Incident Management Assist Team, as well as civilian incident management preparedness advisors in each of the Coast Guard districts. These advisors serve as regional response team co-chairs in their respective regions. And in addition, the Coast Guard has instituted a federal on-scene coordinators course that provides junior incident commanders with the applied knowledge for directing smaller oil spills while enhancing major oil spill response readiness. The Coast Guard also conducts annual spills of national significance exercises, which highlight responses requiring high-level coordination and leadership across DHS, the Coast Guard, and the 15 National Response Team agencies. Lessons learned from these seminars, including the recent last 3 sessions of SONS which focused on the Arctic, serve to establish critical guidance and policy for future spills. In 2016, the Coast Guard will support the EPA, our co-chair to the NRT, as we focus the SONS exercise on an inland crude by rail incident to address this emerging threat. The oil spill preparedness and response mission area remains extremely diverse. It includes a unique blend of authorities and capabilities that span across multiple Coast Guard mission sets. We've made substantial improvements in environmental stewardship through our interagency international partnerships, work to close gaps in personal competencies, and increased efficiencies across the entire mission area. As we move into the Coast Guard's 225th year of operation, we will continue to explore every opportunity to improve on lessons learned from past incidents and further solidify and enhance our spill prevention and response activities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and for all you do for the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Landry. Our next witness today is Ms. Karen Van Dyke, Director of Positioning, Navigation, and Timing and Spectrum Management, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology, U.S. Department of Transportation.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Federal Radio Navigation Plan and the importance of positioning, navigation, and timing systems to America's national, homeland, and economic security and efficiency. Positioning, navigation, and timing, PNT, is critical for transportation safety, efficiency, and capacity increasing programs, including major initiatives such as the Federal Aviation Administration's Air Traffic Control Mission, Intelligent Transportation Systems, and Positive Train Control. The Global Positioning System, in particular, is used for every mode of transportation, and there are numerous safety and efficiency applications of this enabling technology that provide tremendous benefit to America's transportation infrastructure. GPS is a key technology for vehicle collision warning and crash avoidance systems, while enabling shorter routes, increased time and fuel savings, and reduced traffic delays across all modes of transportation. As designated by the 2004 National Security Presidential Directive, NSPD 39, the Department of Transportation has the lead responsibility for the development of GPS requirements for civil applications from all United States government civil departments and agencies. In addition to the transportation applications, GPS is essential for the safe and efficient operations of first responders, search and rescue, resource management, weather forecasting, earthquake monitoring, surveying and mapping, precision agriculture, telecommunications, and financial transactions. The Deputy Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Transportation co-chair the National Executive Committee for Space-Based PNT, known as the PNT XCOM, which includes representatives from 7 cabinet agencies, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Since 1980, the Federal Radionavigation Plan, FRP, has been the official source of positioning, navigation, and timing strategy and planning for the federal government. It is jointly developed biennially by the Departments of Transportation, Defense, and Homeland Security. Section 5.1.2 of the FRP recognizes the need to mitigate disruptions to GPS. Like all radio-based services, GPS is subject to interference from both natural and human-made sources. A loss of GPS service due to either intentional or unintentional interference in the absence of any other means of navigation would have varying negative effects on operations. As stated in the FRP, the U.S. government encourages all GPS users to be aware of the impacts of GPS interference and incorporate or integrate alternative PNT sources where needed to ensure continued operations. The Federal Aviation Administration, for instance, currently maintains a ground-based navigation infrastructure for aviation. GPS enables the safe and efficient movement of waterborne commerce along the U.S. marine transportation system and is especially critical as ports become increasingly congested with larger container ships, tankers, and passenger vessels. In the event of a GPS disruption, methods of conventional navigation may help maintain the flow of commerce along waterways and in ports. However, ports may have to reduce the number of allowed vessel movements, and port congestion may become even more problematic and costly, in addition to an increased risk of maritime accidents. Surface transportation agencies are working with industry to ensure that safety-critical systems that use GPS and its augmentations consider the loss of these PNT services and are able to mitigate its effects. The Federal Railroad Administration encourages an integrated approach to technology by railroads that incorporate systems that are interoperable, synergistic, and redundant to ensure the safe and efficient operation of the railroad system during the loss or disruption of GPS. Signal availability from GPS may not be adequate for surface users experiencing canopy or urban canyon obstructions. The integration of complementary and/or alternate systems that support continued operation in the event of degradation to the GPS signal will be employed in a multi-sensor configuration. The P&T XCOM is currently investigating use of an ELORAN system to serve as a backup P&T capability to GPS. In March of 2015, the Department of Transportation invited comment from the public and industry regarding consideration of an ELORAN system as a backup P&T capability to GPS. There were approximately 200 responses to the Federal Register notice. Most responses were not application-specific, other than for maritime use. Discussion of a P&T backup capability is planned for the next meeting of the National Space-Based P&T Executive Committee in September. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me see. Mr. Fega is now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today about the need for a complement capability for our global positioning system. I've been involved with GPS for many years in the Air Force, at MITRE, and as a congressional staff member. I serve on the National Space-Based Position Navigation and Timing Advisory Board, but I'm not here as a representative. I'm here on my own behalf. I'm accompanied by Charles Shue, who is a former Coast Guard officer and is CEO of UrsaNav, which is a manufacturer of navigation and other equipment. Since becoming an operational system in 1995, we've seen GPS grow to be a major international public utility, and we've all experienced GPS navigation personally. What is less well known is that GPS has become a vital source of precision timing information for networked systems of all kinds. Telephone, financial, other networks, including the internet itself, require timing information often accurate as 1/1,000,000th of a second. GPS is the most practical and inexpensive way for network operators to get such accurate timing, and so of course they have used it and become dependent on it over these 20 years. This makes sense, but the risk is that disruption to GPS would cause disruption to many elements of our modern society. DHS reports that 13 of the 16 critical infrastructures of the United States are critically dependent on GPS, in many cases because of timing. Disruption to GPS could occur from a wide range of sources, including solar storms, errors by humans or software in operating the system, physical attack, or jamming. It is the very success of GPS which creates a call for a complementary system to reinforce it. Senior officials at the Department of Homeland Security have recently called our reliance on GPS and its vulnerabilities a single point of failure for critical infrastructure. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, the importance of our dependence on GPS has been recognized by 3 presidents since 1998. In 2008, all of the concerned departments and agencies across the federal government identified a terrestrial system called Enhanced LORAN as one that could be such a complementary system. The government has never acted to build the system. LORAN stands for Long Range Navigation, and it has existed in various forms since World War II and operated in the United States until 2010. It uses very powerful radio transmitters at very low frequency to transmit signals that receivers use to triangulate position and to get time. Like GPS, it provides timing accurate enough to operate networks. It's difficult to disrupt, and it has different failure modes than GPS, so the two would be a great pairing. The modern version, Enhanced LORAN, is commercially available. A complete system of 19 stations in the United States would cost on the order of $300 million and $20 million a year. Really big money. But we spend $1 billion a year on GPS. Perhaps more important and more practical is that a basic ELORAN system of 4 stations, costing about $40 million, including the use of existing towers and equipment, would provide nationwide timing for all fixed users, which is most users that require precision timing. The system could be a source of revenue. If a contract was properly structured, an ELORAN system could generate enough income to pay for itself over 10 years. While not exact parallels, the FAA's Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast System, where the government and industry cooperate to build a system that generates revenue, And both FAA and the system provider share the income generated. In my written statement, I've offered some further thoughts on this. So first, the administration must do two very important things. They must commit to addressing this important problem, and they must identify and empower a single federal agent who can work with government agencies and industry to implement a solution. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to focus on Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to focus on the ELA-RAN system and see if we can get this thing moving along. Mr. Fega and Mr. Shum, a few questions, probably with rather straightforward answers, just so we can get this stuff on the record. If I understand your testimony correctly, the former LORAN C infrastructure could be rather easily repurposed to support ELA-RAN. Is that correct?
I probably have to argue with easily, but it could certainly be done. Of course, the existing infrastructure, which hasn't been operated since 2010, is decaying. So the Coast Guard would have to look hard at what it's going to take to bring it back. But what ELA-RAN does is go from LORAN C to more modern electronics, fundamentally.
Okay, if the technology, the greatest benefit of the ELA-RAN is that it would provide a backup timing signal, which is then essential for the position and navigation. So if there are multiple towers, you'd have both timing, position, and navigation.
Takes more towers to do the navigation job, but I think, as Ms. Van Dyke pointed out, there are better backups for navigation and position than there are for timing. I've been in a number of meetings in the last few months with infrastructure providers, some of whom are surprised to learn that they have a dependence on GPS timing because they're getting it from a supplier who is dependent on it. Therefore, they are dependent on it, which is why DHS says 13 of our 16 critical infrastructures are dependent.
So just 4 towers could give us nationwide timing.
Timing for fixed items. Moving objects would not be able to do timing with that few number of stations.
And what would be necessary to provide for moving?
19 stations would give complete PNT coverage of the United States, and so some significant portion of that, 10 or 12, would move toward that goal.
The number 40 million has been tossed around today. That would be for the 4 stations for timing only.
And makes the assumption that some of the towers and stations and equipment could be used in the short term.
Available. I understand one such station is now up and operating in Mr. Lobiondo's district.
In Wildwood, New Jersey, yes, sir.
Wildwood, New Jersey. Are there any problems with that operation?
Chuck is actually involved with that, so I'll invite him to respond.
Mr. Garamendi, the station is operating. It would be fully autonomous and unmanned in its fully operational capability. We have a caretaker that comes in and turns it on and turns it off. It's not set up to operate continuously 24/7 right now because it's been off since 2010, but it is fully capable of making that transition with a small investment.
I did see a demonstration of that system at the Naval Observatory last week. Rather impressive. My next question goes to Ms. Van Dyke. Your testimony is interesting, but it reminds me of so much testimony I heard. We're studying it. Could you be a little more precise in the timing of the study and the timing of when you intend to actually deal with this, since this problem was actually noticed in 1998? And in 2008, the executive branch of government made a decision that ELA-RAN was the solution. So where are we now 7 years later?
Yes, thank you for your question, and perhaps Mr. Rescott also wants to chime in. But we are working with our partners in DHS and in DoD as part of a complementary PNT Tiger team. So that was associated with the Federal Register notice that we issued earlier this year to have public and industry feedback. And as I mentioned in my testimony, we do have a space-based PNT executive committee coming up in September, which will discuss this topic. This will be one of the primary topics on their agenda with the Deputy Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Transportation.
Do you consider this to be a significant national security issue, that we could lose GPS, single point of failure?
I do. So I was involved back in 2001 with the Volpe National Transportation System Study on the vulnerability of GPS for transportation, so well aware for a long time of the vulnerabilities of GPS and our significant dependence not only for transportation but other critical infrastructure that's been mentioned. And I do think it is a problem that we need to address and resolve.
When would it be addressed if it's critical? So you have a study coming up, you have a meeting coming up in September to discuss what was discussed 7 years ago.
Well, the complementary PNT Tiger team has really been looking at what's changed in the past 7 years, both from increased dependency on GPS, other technologies that have been developed, as well as increased threats to the GPS system. And again, this will be a major subject of discussion at that meeting with all of the information that we've collected.
You just had a meeting. What was the outcome of that meeting? We should meet again? Was that the outcome?
I'm not sure which meeting you're referring to.
I think you, in your testimony, you said you had a request for information that came out.
We
200 people responded.
Right.
And the result was, let's meet.
So we have a scheduled executive committee meeting in September that will talk about the results from the Federal Register notice, as well as the evaluation of technologies that have been developed.
Mr. Scott, your comments on these issues that I raised?
Sir, we're moving forward. I mean, as Karen outlined,
Yeah, well, the earth is turning too, so.
Yes, sir. But we're taking some important steps to determine what's literally changed since we last looked at this. And I think one of the things that was never looked at previously was the user's input, the folks that actually will receive the signal. And that's what the DOT notice to the Federal Register asked. You know, sort of almost from a Kevin Costner thing. If we build it, will you come? Because one of the things that I think is important to notice is that even if we got the signal in the air tomorrow, it really wouldn't change anything because the receivers aren't there to receive it. And we're sort of working through those issues. And that's what we are asking people. Is this a critical issue to you?
Mr. Shum, are the receivers available?
Yes, sir, the receivers are available today.
No, I understand that, sir, but
That's not what you said.
So they're not available.
You said they're not available.
well,
Are they available or not available?
they are available, sir, but most people do not have them.
Because there is no e-learning.
Fair enough.
Signal.
They're available in Europe and other places where they're using.
Oh, what are the other places? Europe, Russia, China?
I'm not sure of all of them.
They're available in Europe, Russia, and China. Is that correct, Mr. Falga?
Yes, and I think the Japanese are also building out.
Oh, yes, the Japanese too. U.S. Maritime says they want the system. You're aware of that, I suppose.
Yes, sir.
Why are we getting the runaround here? Mr. Scott, why are we getting the runaround?
I don't have a good answer for that, sir, but I will tell you that the administration is pushing forward and we're working through the Space-Based PNT Executive Committee to come up with the correct solution. We hope to move forward on that. We
God
look forward
help
to
us,
the
another
results.
committee.
Sir, as established under the Federal Radionavigation Plan.
Can you give me some estimate of when a decision would be made by that committee?
I will tell you that the next meeting of that committee is in September. I can't speak for the leadership of that committee.
Who are the leaders of the committee?
It is chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, as per the Federal Radionavigation Plan.
Ms. Van Dyke, are they expected to attend the meeting?
Yes, they are.
What day in September?
September 3rd.
I yield back.
I think the ranking member, we'll get back to that too. Mr. Gibbs is recognized. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Van Dyke, in your testimony, you mentioned the possibility of backups at ports, and increase accidents if the GPS technology is disrupted. Have we had any occurrences of backups, our GPS shutting down? Can you give us what the situation was, status? Have we had, can you tell me if we've had the incidents happen or how critical they were?
So most of the incidents of GPS interference that we've had are actually testing the Department of Defense conducts. And for aviation, if you're a pilot, you'll see notice to airmen of areas of airspace where GPS is deemed unreliable due to the military testing, which again is why the FAA has maintained its ground-based navigation aid infrastructure. There have been other unintentional incidences. Again, there was one in San Diego with a Navy ship that caused interference in the port of San Diego. And then on a lower power level, there are GPS jammers that plug into cigarette lighters and cause a smaller radius of interference, but that certainly is, has been most notably experienced at Newark International Airport.
We need to have a backup
We do.
complementary system. Mr. Fega, I'm just curious, maybe this is not the right question, but we hear so much about spectrum. Is spectrum an issue with trying to develop the C-Lawrence system or not?
Spectrum is an issue in that there are more and more demands to use spectrum. There are interests in providing cellular services with more spectrum, including spectrum that's close to where GPS operates. If some of these proposals are actually implemented, we may see effects on a GPS service. Come back also to the question you asked a moment ago of Karen. There are thousands of events per day, but they're small. Okay. They're mostly these little jammers. There was a famous case of Newark Airport having problem with effects of a jammer. Finally, a person was caught, fined $32,000 for the violations, but there was day after day. These are people who are trying to hide their own movement, perhaps from their own employer or what have you. They buy devices that claim they have a range of only 10 meters, and in fact have a range of 2 or 3 miles.
So drug interdiction could be...
Criminal activity, smuggling, right. These are when these things get used.
The Lawrence system, would it be harder to compromise or not?
I'm sorry,
the other system, the Lawrence system, would be harder?
Oh, it would be much harder to disrupt, because instead of generating 100 watts from 11,000 miles, generates 300,000 watts from 1,000 miles or less.
Mr. Resicott, I said your name right.
Thank the gentleman. I guess let's get back on the E-Loran thing. You know who Brad Parkinson is? You know who Brad Parkinson is? Who is Brad Parkinson?
Often called the father of E-Loran, the first director.
And the GPS.
I'm sorry, GPS.
GPS. Here's what he said. E-Loran is the only cost-effective backup for national needs. It is completely interoperable with and independent of GPS, with different propagation and failure mechanisms, plus significantly superior robustness to radio frequency interference and jamming. It is a seamless backup, and its use will deter threats to U.S. national and economic security by disrupting GPS reception. Have you heard of? Do you know who Brad Parkinson is? So he's going to be at this meeting on September 3rd. Do you think you'll hear anything different than what I just said? You think he's changed his mind on E-Loran?
No. So Dr. Parkinson is also heavily involved with the Space-Based P&T Advisory Board, serving as one of the vice chairs, and certainly has advocated for E-Loran, as you've mentioned.
Are there any dissenters? Meaning, who's arguing that we don't need a backup system to GPS? Meaning, I'm guessing, because you're having the meeting, that there's got to be opposition, one side versus another side, different papers, different studies, different research. So who's on the side arguing that we don't need an E-Loran system, that GPS is fine?
I am not aware of that argument. I think it's really assessing which technology is right as a single national backup to GPS, and again going to the user needs in terms of user adoption of equipment as a backup to.
So what are the
GPS.
what alternatives are you guys going to be discussing to GPS then, besides ELRAN? What are the other alternatives out there?
So there certainly are commercial techniques, local RF ranging techniques, and there's private companies that offer those services. There are.
You're saying there's alternatives for a national positioning system, ground-based, that does not involve satellites, and they're what again?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is looking at how to extend some of these local systems to a national system, and what the cost trade-off of doing that is. Also, it's looking at, again, what users will adopt, so that was really what we wanted to focus on in the Federal Register notice and have feedback. So right now, the Federal Aviation Administration operates over 1,000 VOR DMEs and 1,200 instrument landing systems, and so the commercial aviators are equipped to use those systems.
So let me ask you again, if you don't have GPS, so say that it goes down, what are the alternatives to GPS?
So they really vary in terms of positioning techniques and timing techniques. So
what other system can do everything that GPS or ELRAN does? Put it that way. If they all vary, which ones are as good as GPS and ELRAN?
So they vary in terms of their performance characteristics. There's nothing that's...
Ms. Van Dyke, when you say they, I'm just trying to get you to tell me exactly what you mean by they.
Nothing as good as GPS. GPS is a three-dimensional, highly accurate system, and so if there were another alternative...
Not underwater, not inside buildings, right? Does GPS extend underwater?
No.
No. So what do subs use?
Inertial navigation systems, sonar.
And it doesn't go into buildings either, right? GPS doesn't.
That's correct.
So you have GPS, that's one. You have ELRAN, that's another system, right? Then what is the next system that would be competing against those two?
So there's local RF ranging systems that can be deployed and have been deployed. The question is whether they make sense for a nationwide backup. There are inertial navigation systems that work with accelerometers and gyros that need to be calibrated, but are very accurate systems. So for autonomous vehicles, we're looking at the integration of inertial with LiDAR, so laser ranging cameras, map matching technologies. So there's an integrated multi-sensor capability. So again, it's looking at what the performance requirements are that the users need.
How many ELRAN ground systems already exist?
I'll defer to the Coast Guard on that.
There's 8 remaining towers.
8?
8 remaining towers.
8 remaining towers.
Sir. And we have the one that we have a cooperative research and development agreement with UrsaNab, which they're working out of Wildwood.
And you say it would take 16 to cover everything?
Those were his words.
19.
19 for nationwide coverage, including navigation. 4 for a minimal system that would provide only timing.
So we have the minimal system now?
No, we don't.
We don't?
No, there are no stations operating other than Wildwood on a test basis.
Gotcha. Okay. But
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Actually, hang on. You sure don't?
I see the Iceman's arrived here, so we'll get to icebreakers in a few moments, but Ms. Van Dyke, I hear your testimony and I'm going, here we go again. Yeah, there are undoubtedly alternative systems, but all of them are localized, and then coordinating all of those together is going to require some sort of overarching system. You know that. I think everybody that's interested in this has known this for at least 15 years. And you have just very well stated why there is a thing called federal time. Maybe if we study this a little longer, we'll be able to find some alternative. You talked about internal systems. Yes, somebody can develop an internal cesium system that you can carry around with you that keeps time. Not likely to solve the underlying problem. I've had it. And I think that several of us sit on the Armed Services Committee also. And I'll tell you, this is a very significant national security issue that cannot be delayed any longer. There is a very good reason why Russia, Europe, and I suppose now Japan have decided they need an ELRAN system of some sort. And it's high time for this nation to put one in place, because if we don't, GPS is going to go down. And when it goes down, there's going to be a significant national security issue, to say nothing of a significant economic issue for this nation. For $40 million, we could set up a national timing system, not navigation, but at least timing, which is integral, absolutely essential for the continued operation of our electrical grid, our financial systems, transportation systems, including those FAA issues, where there are probably several dozen companies that would like to sell us a new shake-and-bake opportunity for navigation. But without an ELRAN system in place, ASAP, this country is in serious, serious jeopardy. And I'm really interested in hearing what's going to go on September the 3rd. And I'm telling you now that if you guys don't get your act together, then we must pass legislation that designates a specific federal agency to get this done with a specific time frame. Now listen carefully to what I'm saying. I don't intend to back off. And so this is a message to the deputies, of which I happen to have been one in my past, and I understand full good and well the federal time system. Let us study this, but again, and this goes to the Coast Guard also. You've had the original responsibility, and frankly, I think you have failed in that responsibility. You've gone round and round, and I happen to know that there's some folks at OMB are a major problem in this. And I know who they are, and I'm going to have a discussion with them. If they happen to be in the audience, then maybe we can have that discussion right away. You put this nation at risk. Now, do we need a single federal agency responsible to get this done and a time frame to get it done? Or are we going to have multiple agencies that are going to kick the ball back and forth? Mr. Viscotti.
Sir, I think we await the results of our PNT XCOM. That's a group that's designated to do this work, and I think they're moving towards a solution.
So we don't need a single federal agency, we need multiple agencies?
Sir, I yield to the XCOM as to how best to implement the system.
Oh, you're good. I guess that's what you get paid for, obfuscation. Ms. Van Dyke, do we need a single federal agency?
We are working closely with the interagency on the way forward. And again, as Mr. Rassicott said, we don't want to presuppose what the outcome of the XCOM is, which is co-chaired by DOD and DOT. So we already are in a multi-agency arrangement for GPS and other.
Mr. Fega, how long have you been involved in this issue?
I've been involved in GPS since the 80s.
PNT?
PNT, yeah.
Do we need a single federal agency responsible for getting this done?
We will, and I think what will happen is once there's a determination to actually move forward, the interagency will decide who has to take the lead role and work with all the agencies and actually get it done, deal with the industry, work out a financing arrangement and so on.
We haven't spent much time on a public-private partnership. There's been some discussion of the commercial application of ELRAN. A brief discussion of public-private partnerships, and I think we better ice this thing and talk about icebreakers. Public-private partnership.
Right. The idea there is that a private provider builds a system, but has a federally provided funding mechanism available to pay it back. I'll give you an example. I'm on the board of a company called Digital Globe, which flies commercial imaging satellites. It built these satellites at private expense, but it operates half of them on behalf of the U.S. government and gets an annual payment. So all the financing, construction, launch, the whole thing was private. the government pays back with essentially a user payment. Imagine a similar situation here.